Hi there, I'm Wendy McCallum, burnout and alcohol coach and wellness expert, and you're listening to Bite Size Balance, where everyday extraordinary women share their stories, expertise, and wisdom, all in the name of lifting each other up and creating a better life by design. Whether it's wellness, career, relationships, food, alcohol, mindfulness, hormones, or parenting, we talk about all things women's balance. If your life looks great on paper, but it still feels like something's missing, you're in the right place. Welcome to Bite Size Balance.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Bite Size Balance. I have a great guest with me today. I'm really excited to have this conversation. I've got Dr. Brooke Scheller here. Hi, Brooke.
Hi, Wendy. Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here today.
Yeah, I'm going to tell people a little bit about you, but then I'll leave it up to you to kind of fill in the blanks because I've got your bio here. Full disclosure, this is the first time that Brooke and I have met. But I thought that her area of expertise would be really interesting to the Bite Size Balance listeners. And I just thought it was a really nice intersection between some of the areas that I focus in on as a coach. And I also knew that I would learn a lot from her. So Dr. Brooke Scheller is a doctor of clinical nutrition, a certified nutrition specialist, and an expert in nutrition for alcohol use. She combines her clinical background with a passion for health tech and innovation in the food, supplement, and personalized wellness industry. Dr. Brooke is a leader in the space, pioneering the understanding of how alcohol impacts the gut, our nutritional pathways, and the brain through nutritional deficiencies. And we're going to talk really specifically today about alcohol and hormones, specifically women's hormones in perimenopause and menopause. Do you want to add anything to that? Because I'm sure there's stuff that's missing from that.
I'm sure there's stuff that's missing from that. I keep myself quite busy. I have a few different things that I work on, but after last year getting sober, alcohol and nutrition and the intersection there has really become a huge passion for me. I'm actually working on a book right now, which will come out in late 2023. So no shortage of things going on my end, but it's such a pleasure for me to bring my background together with this area that I feel really passionately about. So I'm excited to share more about that with you and your listeners today.
Fantastic. Well, can we start with your story? Because as you said, this hasn't always been your area of focus, but something happened about a year ago that changed things for you and led you to change your relationship with alcohol. So I would love it if you could start wherever feels right to you, Brooke, in terms of the story. I mean, sometimes people go back to high school, but if you don't need to go back there, you don't need to go back there. But love to know what led you to that point where you realized that you wanted to make a change, and then how did you go about making that change?
Yeah. So I won't go all the way back to high school. I'll spare you those details, but I've always been a big drinker, even as a nutritionist. So I have a bachelor's degree, a master's degree, and a doctorate. And I drank throughout all of that training and had always hoped that alcohol could be part of a healthy diet, could be part of a healthy lifestyle. And I started out my work in clinical practice. I worked for several years starting in weight loss, and eventually moving into working in a wellness center as a functional medicine practitioner, where we used to do a lot of customized testing. So blood testing, stool testing, DNA, you name it, we tested it. And from there, we would develop custom protocols for our clients, supplements, diet, lifestyle modifications, et cetera. I worked with a lot of chronic illness, a lot of autoimmune disease, a lot of GI disorders, a lot of mystery symptoms and people that weren't really sure what was going on, a lot of hormone imbalances, especially the thyroid and thyroid autoimmunity, and of course, how that plays a role into hormones as well. And several years ago, I left clinical practice and started working in a startup company in New York City. And as I mentioned, I had really always been a big drinker, but now moving into this space where I'm working in the city, it's a very high pressure job. I'm surrounded by people who are going out to happy hours all the time. And, we had free alcohol at the office that we could have after 5 o'clock. And I found myself really, really escalating in the amount that I was drinking. It had always been something that, looking back, it affected my life in certain ways, but really over the last 2 years, I would say almost your pandemic years, for example, things had definitely escalated. And I know that this is something that is really common that people have experienced during the pandemic is we may have had a little bit of an issue simmering on the back burner with alcohol. And then the pandemic really turned up the heat on that for things to boil over. You know, we were stuck at home, we were working from home, dealing with our families in a different way, dealing with isolation or having to adapt our schedules if we have children. And I found myself, you know, getting to the point towards the end of my drinking career where it would get earlier and earlier. And, you know, I was working from home, so left to my own devices and thinking, you know, maybe I'll have a drink at 2:00. And here I am working from home and no one really knows. And for me, I always felt like I was living a double life as someone who was a heavy drinker and a doctor of nutrition, because I really knew how alcohol was affecting me. I knew that it had caused elevated liver enzymes in my blood work. I knew that it was contributing to histamine reactions I was having, a lot of skin hiving, a lot of GI issues that were going on. And it's one of those things that if you're a drinker or you have a history of drinking, that you know it's easier said than done when we know that we're having an impact from alcohol, that we really should be stopping. And I think for many of us, it takes that breaking point. It takes that kind of quote unquote hitting rock bottom before we start to make a change. So in June of 2021, I made the decision to quit drinking. And I, interestingly enough, the 6 months prior to that, I had been asked to write a chapter in a textbook on complementary and integrative approaches to substance use disorders. And I authored a chapter on nutrition and supplements. So ironically, this was not planned, but the same month that I got sober was the same month that that book published. And I look at that kind of as a coincidence or ironic that the timeline aligned with that. But, you know, initially when I first quit drinking, it was out of, I need to change my lifestyle. I'm at the point where I'm really feeling the physical effects. I'm feeling the mental effects. I had a lot of anxiety, a lot of depressive type of symptoms. And shortly after, you know, the fog cleared from my brain, I realized I wrote a book on this. I wrote a textbook on how to use food to support this type of journey. And so I was able to implement some of the practices that I had researched into my journey. And really that helped support me in staying on track and moving forward. And I will credit some of the tactics that I used from a nutrition standpoint to really getting me through that difficult time in early sobriety, and also being something that I focus really heavily on now in keeping myself on the right path. And so I think what's really interesting about this space and the work that I'm doing now is there are conversations and books that were written several years back on, you know, when someone's in recovery from alcohol, how you can use specific foods or what types of nutrients they may be deficient. But I'm finding that the space is really lacking today in the sober curious world, how we use nutrition, supplements, and wellness practices to help enable and inspire that journey. So that is something that I'm really hoping to do with the work that I do now, is just bring more of this information to people so that they can have other ways that, you know, not only affect how we mentally think about alcohol, how our, you know, traumas or our stressors contribute to reasons why we drink, but also looking at the biochemical approach. So what's going on in the body that might make me more likely to have a difficult problem cutting back alcohol. And then once I know that, I can use foods and different types of, again, lifestyle modifications to support that journey.
Okay, this is so interesting to me. I know nothing about this. So I'm just going to be full disclosure, like nothing about this, because this is not the world I coach in. And, you know, even in terms of my past history, doing food and nutrition related coaching and all the work that I did around that, obviously at that point in time, the last thing I wanted to look at was alcohol, because I was still drinking in a way that felt really, what was the word that you used? Like felt like I was living a double life as well at that time. So I definitely resonate with that whole idea of being a wellness practitioner. And then at the same time, knowing that you're way out of balance in this one area. So I'm super curious about this. Can you give can you give me an example or two of something that might be happening biochemically that might make it harder for you?
Yeah. So one of the things that I speak to my clients frequently about, and I speak, on other podcasts or give presentations on, is the statistic is actually around that 95% of us that are regular drinkers have imbalanced blood sugar. And so because alcohol has a very significant impact on our blood sugar levels, it affects how our liver produces different hormones that kind of boost blood sugar or cause the body to produce glucose, that we actually have imbalances in blood sugar that can manifest as cravings. So for example, when we take a first drink, we often find that we feel, a little bit elated from that. We might get a little bit of a boost of energy. And then shortly after, we get a craving for another drink, right? And part of that can have to do with the blood sugar response that's happening in the body. When we drink and we have an increase in our blood sugar levels, that is often followed by a steep drop off. And this drop in blood sugar is often what manifests as that craving for another drink. The other thing to be mentioned is that when we are trying to eliminate alcohol, we tend to have really intense cravings, not only for alcohol, but also for sugar. And so anytime we go into a state of low blood sugar, we're putting ourselves at risk for potentially picking up a drink. So one of the things that I often do with my clients is make sure that their diet is very high in protein, high in fiber, complex carbohydrates that are going to help taper off that blood sugar response and help us to avoid any of those low drops in blood sugar, because that's where we get ourselves into a danger zone. And so it's very interesting when we start to look at these patterns that people have. And one example that I'll give is, if you have lunch and don't have an afternoon snack, by the time you get home and it's 5 p.m., it's that trigger time to drink, ask yourself, when was the last time you ate? Because sometimes for those of us who are used to drinking on a regular basis, that hunger, that normal low blood sugar hunger feeling actually manifests for us as a craving for a drink. So if we have something to eat instead of that drink, we can oftentimes avoid that craving and avoid picking up that drink.
Yeah, that totally makes sense to me. This is all stuff that I would have talked about in my past life. Well, I still do sometimes, but it's not my focus anymore. So that makes complete sense to me, because I used to, when I talked about blood sugar, I always say that when you're down in that low, that's almost always corresponding to a high in your blood sugar. When you're down there, it's like one level of the craving that is purely physical, and your body is literally, your brain's starving because it's feeding off of glucose as its primary source of fuel. There isn't any glucose in your blood. So your brain is starving and your body is sending you a very strong message to get some sugar in your blood fast. And we know from experience that the way to get sugar into our blood fastest is to eat some kind of refined carbohydrate, but alcohol is that. Like, alcohol is the source of, you get a nice hit to your blood sugar from that. So that makes total sense to me. And I guess you could almost start work proactively on preventing cravings for alcohol or reducing cravings for alcohol, just like you can reduce cravings for sugar by eating almost before you're hungry and making sure that you're building snacks into your day. And that could be a helpful part of early sobriety or longer term sobriety for people.
Exactly. So my rule of thumb is never going more than 3 or 4 hours without eating, because again, once you get into that place, it's very difficult for you to make a rational decision.
Totally.
And this goes all the way back to breakfast. This goes back to how you ate the night before, because if you're setting yourself up in the morning with a blood sugar imbalance, and this is something interesting that I talk about too, and had a discussion on a podcast last week around intermittent fasting. Because with these individuals, especially that are looking to rebalance blood sugar post-alcohol use, intermittent fasting may be really difficult until we start to manage blood sugar again, and until we start to really let go of those cravings. Because I find with people, if they do skip breakfast and they're not eating till lunchtime, that kind of cycle can cause that imbalanced blood sugar to start the day. And then once you start eating, you're kind of on this path of eating for the rest of the day. Right.
Yeah, I can totally see that. Yeah.
Very, very different from someone who doesn't have a history of heavy drinking. And it's important for people to understand that, because I think a lot of us try those things like a keto diet or an intermittent fasting diet and feel like we're not successful and that maybe there's something wrong with us. And the reality is that based on our biochemistry and our health history, it might just not be the right diet for us right now until we balance the rest of the body.
Yeah. And I can see too, psychologically, how it might not be very helpful to take. I mean, I'm such a fan. I'm guessing just from what you just said that you and I are on the same page. We might not be on this, but I am a huge fan of only doing one thing at a time. And when it comes to drinking, if you're trying to change your relationship with alcohol, that's the thing to focus on. Don't start, taking on some crazy mad eating plan at the same time. But this, basic sort of guidance around eating regularly, trying to eat good quality foods, making sure you have good proteins and healthy fats and fiber with your meals all sounds really sensible to me and like it would be very helpful. But I can see how psychologically taking on a deprivation-based diet of any sort, which frankly, in my opinion, is any diet, whether it's keto, intermittent fasting, or the Whole30, taking on that type of a program, which roots you in that place of deprivation. Like, I'm getting ripped off. I can't eat these foods on top of, I also can't drink, really just being a recipe for disaster. Like, psychologically, that feels like a terrible idea to me. What do you think of that?
I 100% agree. And especially as we're looking to build long-term habits, we're looking to build new kind of lifestyle regime. It's difficult when we tie alcohol into something that is more short-term or not a long-term solution, because then we're still connecting it as this, oh, well, I can cut out alcohol for a month. But the reality is, if we do cut it out for a month, a lot of times when we go back to it, we're going back at full steam, right? We haven't necessarily rebuilt those new habits. We haven't necessarily, created a long-term solution or plan for ourselves. And again, I think that diet is one of those things. And I say diet in a general sense of an eating pattern, not necessarily dieting, but using food and the way that we eat and what we eat to support this alcohol-free journey can really, really make a change for a lot of people. I'm working with many clients in my online platform right now that really have found that this is the key to what's been holding them back. So if you are someone who's tried to quit before, hasn't necessarily had success with that, there may be something, again, biochemically that can be supported through these food choices that you make that can really start to shift things for you and make it a little bit easier.
Yeah, that makes complete sense to me. I think that's great. Thanks for explaining that. Yeah. Okay, let's get into hormones.
Okay.
Let's get into reproductive hormones. Let's get into women's hormones and what's happening for women during perimenopause and the connection with alcohol. Because we've touched on this in a number of different podcasts for people who are listening. Dr. Sarah Bailey and I have talked about this several times. I talk about it all the time, even though I am by no means an expert in this area. I do have a pretty good understanding of the relationship between women's hormones and drinking. And then I have my own story around how my perimenopause symptoms were effectively eradicated by quitting drinking, and then came back with a vengeance when I went into full menopause. But I would love to hear your explanation. I'll just let you start wherever feels like the right place for you to start on this, around the connection between alcohol and women's hormones and what things we need to be thinking about that we're not thinking about enough.
Yeah. So this is a great topic, Wendy, and I'm glad we're touching on this for this podcast, because I think when many people think about hormones and alcohol, they seem pretty far unrelated, right? It seems like, okay, maybe alcohol, we know it affects the liver, we know it maybe affects the gut. But when we think about hormones, we think, okay, how is that really happening? What's really happening there? There's a few different ways. And one of my other big areas that I talk about, Wendy, is the gut and the digestive system. And the gut is very significantly impacted by alcohol. It contributes to microbial imbalance, so an imbalance in those good and bad probiotic bacteria, for example. It contributes to intestinal permeability, or what we also call leaky gut. So it can contribute to autoimmunity and other concerns in that regard. The other thing as it relates, and this gets into hormones, is we have to think about how our body processes the hormones that it's making. So the liver, which is actually a part of our digestive system, is two things. It's the place where our body's producing hormones, metabolizing hormones, and helping to eliminate them from the system. It's also the place where we are metabolizing alcohol. And one thing that I like to explain is that the reproductive system is the only system in the body that you can take out all of the organs, take, for example, a hysterectomy, and still survive, right? So you can remove the entire reproductive system and still live. You can't remove the digestive system. You can't remove the cardiovascular system. So what happens is anytime the body is in a state of stress, it's going to immediately put pause on any unnecessary functions.
Right.
That being, for a lot of people, the reproductive system. And so this is part of why women are more affected by this than men, because women are more driven to hormonal changes naturally throughout the course of the month, throughout the course of a day, et cetera. So when we start to think about that example, the liver is the main kind of site of metabolism for alcohol. So alcohol as a toxic substance, when it comes into the body, all of the other systems get paused because alcohol needs to be metabolized and removed from the body because it's effectively damaging the system.
Can we just pause for a second just to say, just to be very clear here, the reason why that's happening is because it is actually a poison and our body needs to get rid of it. And so it's going to put everything else on hold until it does that, because it's mostly concerned always with our short-term survival over our long-term survival, and reproductive hormones are only necessary for our long-term survival, not for our short-term survival in the moment. So your body is trying to take care of you in that moment that this is happening, right?
Exactly. So you're exactly right in that, I think we often forget when we're drinking on a regular basis that it is a poison. It is, I was telling my sister this story this weekend and telling her that the reason that alcohol makes us feel drunk is because it's effectively poisoning us. When we are getting dizzy, when we're getting, the silly feelings that we get from alcohol, it's actually because it's poisoning our brain. It's poisoning our body. And so, yes, the body is going to say, this is the most important thing for me to focus on right now, because this is essentially life-threatening, right? Life-threatening. If we have enough alcohol, it can kill us. So we are going to put pause on all of those other processes. That includes fat burning. That includes, metabolism of nutrients and absorption of nutrients, the whole gambit, right? So when we are focused, our liver is focused on that, it's going to put pause on all of the hormonal processes that the liver plays. So the liver not only helps serve as a part of how we develop our hormones, because it has to do with fats and cholesterol, and those being the basis for our hormones, also the metabolism and the excretion of hormonal products. So what oftentimes happens in women when we drink alcohol on a regular basis is we have buildup of estrogens and hormone byproducts that aren't necessarily being excreted from the system. When these hormones build up, it's not necessarily that you would test your estrogen levels, for example, and they would be high, but these excess hormones often store themselves in tissue. They store themselves in fat tissue. This also goes into where the digestive system becomes really important, because having a bowel movement is an effective way to eliminate hormones from our body. So if we're constipated, those hormones can potentially get reabsorbed into the system. So this kind of buildup of estrogen can create a lot of hormonal imbalances for women, even postmenopausal, when we think that estrogen is low. It's also a really big reason why the risk for breast cancer raises very significantly with heavy alcohol use. And that is because that estrogen buildup is what is toxic to the body, what is stored in the tissue, and what can become cancerous. And so, everything from feeling increased menopause symptoms to early menopause to someone who's premenopausal and has extreme PMS or heavy bleeding, or even someone who, again, has risk for cancer or a history of breast cancer. All of these should be in consideration when we're thinking about what we can do to support those types of imbalances or diagnoses that we have. That alcohol isn't necessarily helping in any of those areas. In fact, it's actually potentially harming us.
Yeah. And I think what happens is if we're just focusing in more on women who are in perimenopause and struggling with some of those perimenopausal symptoms, is that we actually start using alcohol as a tool to help with those specifically. So we believe, I certainly did this in my early 40s to mid 40s, believed that alcohol helped me to sleep, that it helped me because I was, struggling with sleep disturbances that I didn't recognize were likely rooted at least somewhat in hormones. And also like mood swings. I was talking to a client about this morning. We were having a laugh about how we just didn't make the connection between the mood swings and the fact that alcohol might actually be making those worse. And in our minds, it actually made things, like for me, it evened things out. And I actually drank sometimes because of my frustration with my inability to manage my mood in a way that I had always been able to manage it. So I think a lot of women do that. We fall into this trap of thinking like actually alcohol is going to help. It's helping us to manage some of this stuff that we're struggling with, whether or not we recognize that it might be related to hormones, shifting hormones. But it's just making it worse.
Yeah. And I think it's an important point too, because we see symptoms of anxiety and depression increase during those times as well. And for many of us, the coping mechanism that we know is to drink. And if we have a history of drinking and we've drank since we were, younger to cope with stress and to cope with these challenges, then our response, our natural response, and this has to do with dopamine, it has to do with our brain and how we've essentially trained our body to cope with difficult emotions or to seek pleasure when we are feeling low mood or imbalanced in our energy levels. So it's very normal for us to seek out those patterns again, especially if we have been choosing that previously. But it's also important, as you mentioned, mood swings and insomnia. And I know a lot of people will think, hey, alcohol helps put me to sleep. Over the long term, it actually has a very deleterious effect on our sleep. It initially gives us this sedative type of sensation, but it actually causes these blood sugar imbalances while we're sleeping. Oftentimes people are waking up in the middle of the night. Sometimes they're waking up to urinate, which is also, again, alcohol is a diuretic. So it's going to help move those things through our system a little bit faster. And the reality is that, what's very interesting is when we look at how alcohol affects the brain neurotransmitters, the feel-good hormones or the hormones in our brain, it does have these sedative type effects. So it will kind of fool your body into thinking, hey, I need this to help me sleep. When the reality, and what I like to do with my clients, especially if they have these types of imbalances, is, are you benefiting from alcohol because it actually increases your GABA activity, which is a relaxant neurotransmitter? And how do we eat foods and potentially use supplements to support GABA activity in your body without using alcohol, right? So there's a lot of indications, and it's a little bit of that mystery and that puzzle piecing exercise to say, how are you using alcohol? What's really going on? Because when I can find really that biochemical pathway and those reasons that maybe alcohol has been helpful for you, we can always support that with food, again, a supplement, or using lifestyle modifications in order to boost mood, improve dopamine, and all of those other good things as well.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I wonder what your experience has been with this. I know this is a relatively newer area of practice for you, but I have yet to meet a perimenopausal woman for whom reducing or eliminating alcohol has not, over the long term, led to a significant improvement in sleep. Like I actually haven't met anyone, but I also have met hundreds of perimenopausal women who would say alcohol helps them get to sleep. And that was definitely where I was for a long time. I thought it was the thing that would help me get to sleep. It would really shut my brain down. I used it as a way to get off the nonstop hamster wheel. And when I started this, I guess, really exploring my own relationship with alcohol, learning more about the science of alcohol. One of the things I talk about a lot on this podcast is the fact that alcohol is a depressant, but then it has a stimulant effect. And we just never talk about the fact that we are actually releasing these very chemicals that we, as a burnout coach, these are the things I'm talking to women about all the time. I'm talking to them about cortisol constantly. And the fact that drinking alcohol actually causes our brain to pump out more cortisol and adrenaline in response to that, because it's, it's noticing that something's off and that homeostasis has been affected. And the fact that that cortisol starts coursing, and the fact that there's a lag on that. So you go to sleep and then the cortisol hits your system, combined with the blood sugar piece that you're talking about, and the fact that it's a diuretic, it's a recipe for a shitty sleep. As a perimenopausal woman.
Something interesting about that is you also have melatonin as part of that cycle as well. So when cortisol is high, melatonin is low, and they kind of work in an opposite kind of parallel universe, where when cortisol drops at the end of the night, that's when melatonin increases. So if you've got elevated cortisol at night, you don't necessarily have this natural spike of melatonin that's going to help you go to sleep as well. So it's such a complex scenario, because then you start talking about serotonin and serotonin's conversion to, melatonin, and how these brain chemicals play a really important role as well in not only cortisol. And again, I think you make a great point in that we use alcohol to shut off our brains. We are trained with alcohol as a coping mechanism. And if we don't have or find other coping mechanisms, which might be, exercise, or it might be meditation, or it might be therapy, or something else that helps us kind of relieve ourselves and feel more comfortable working through those challenges that we have. Because I think, and I can say this for myself and so many people that I've worked with, before I got sober, I didn't know how to deal with my emotions. I didn't know how to deal with my stress, my anxiety. I would just say alcohol shuts it off, and that's my go-to, right? And when we get it out of our lifestyle, we then have to figure out ways to cope. We have to figure out how we can sit with our feelings, how we can sit with these frustrations. But the good news is that there are thousands of ways that we can do this. We just have to start practicing and learning new ways and new tools to put in our toolbox. And again, nutrition can be one of them, because then we're focusing on the good stuff we're putting in our body. We're not necessarily focusing on that deprivation mindset. And while some people feel a little icky in the beginning when they are initially coming down off of alcohol or taking it out of their lifestyle, by supporting that with good nutrition, you're going to feel better sooner than you would without, right? Yeah. So it might only be a week or two before you start feeling more energy, you start feeling better, and you start saying, wow, I prefer this much more over waking up with a hangover, getting a yucky night of sleep, and the like.
Yeah, for sure. Can I go back to the GABA piece for a second? You said you gave us some examples of some dietary things that we can do to help the production of GABA, which is what I think you said many of us, alcohol is filling that role in many ways for drinkers.
Yeah. So there's a few different things that happen as it relates to the brain neurotransmitters. So GABA is one of them that is, I'll back up really quickly to say that our neurotransmitters are created from amino acids, which are found in proteins. And they are converted through a series of processes that include vitamins. So vitamins like B6, B12, certain minerals like magnesium and zinc. So when we are lacking not only amino acids, but also some of these nutrients, which of course we can become deficient in by drinking. So it's really this vicious cycle when we continue to drink. We don't naturally produce these neurotransmitters that are our feel-good hormones. GABA is one that's very interesting, because when GABA is high, it's our relaxing neurotransmitter. So alcohol actually increases GABA activity for the short term. So that's part of the reason why alcohol will help us to relax. The other thing that it does is it reduces activity in another neurotransmitter called glutamate. Glutamate is an excitatory neurotransmitter. And so it basically lowers the activity there. So we almost have a situation where if you were to think about GABA as the brakes and glutamate as the gas in the car, we're basically taking our foot off the gas and putting our foot on the brake, right? And so that is what alcohol does in our body. Now, the challenge is that, or the thing that I like to think about is our body produces these hormones naturally. What we need in order to produce them are these amino acid precursors and these vitamin and mineral cofactors. And so when we are not consuming those foods in the diet or at adequate amounts, again, protein is not only going to be really important for stabilizing blood sugar, but now we're also thinking about how we use protein specifically to support these types of neurotransmitters. So one example is tryptophan. And tryptophan, we often think about with turkey because we think, oh, we have Thanksgiving dinner and then we take a nap. Tryptophan is found in a lot of meats. So not only turkey, but also chicken, also fish, and some other plant-based, so different beans or nuts and seeds. And tryptophan is the precursor for our serotonin, which is one of our feel-good hormones, right? We also have tyrosine, which is a precursor for our dopamine. So again, we need to be consuming enough protein to be getting those nutrients. And then again, to get kind of one layer complex that we won't dive too deep into today, but there's also genetic changes that people have. So some people are naturally more likely to be deficient in these enzymes that help to produce serotonin or dopamine or GABA. And so when that happens, we have this kind of compounded effect. And, you know, again, alcohol can give us that feel good if it is boosting GABA activity, decreasing this glutamate activity, increasing serotonin, dopamine, but there are other ways to do that. So when we think about, again, providing the right types of food and nutrition to support those neurotransmitters, and when we look at something like dopamine, a lot of times it's a learned experience. So it is really how we are seeking pleasure, how we're connecting our brain with things that drive pleasure. Alcohol being one of them that really spikes dopamine, where if we're consuming alcohol on a regular basis, something like spending time in nature doesn't feel as good, right? But when we retrain our dopamine pathways, we can actually start to experience more pleasure from some of these lighter, simpler things. So the brain chemistry piece is super complex, but it's an important piece of the puzzle because, again, when we think about anxiety and depression and all of those other mood changes that happen as part of that natural menopause cycle, we want to be thinking about, again, foods that not only maybe support the liver and help with the body's natural detoxification, waste removal, and supporting digestion, but how we can also, again, support those important brain vitamins and minerals that we need in order to feel good as well.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. I think for anybody who's listening, who's feeling totally overwhelmed by this and thinking, how the hell do I do all of that? I would say probably Dr. Brooke can give you some really specific instructions that are super helpful, but a good starting place would be to go back to the kind of stuff that you may have heard me talk about before, which is, you know, a very, as varied as possible, real food diet, rich in plants, good sources of protein, try to stay away from the processed foods, making sure you're getting lots of fiber and drinking the water. So it's not rocket science, this stuff. And, you know, if we are eating a real food diet that's rich in plants and, you know, we're trying to keep some variety in all of it, we're likely going to be getting a lot of these things that we need. It's just that we've gotten to a point where, a lot of us anyway, where we're just not eating enough of those real foods. And so and that combined with the way that alcohol affects our gut, as Dr. Brooke was talking about, and impacts our liver, and all of that can lead to nutritional deficiencies and problems there. So start simple, guys. Just go back to the stuff that I'm always talking about in terms of eating more real food. And there's so much more that you can dive into on all of this, but it just makes total sense what Brooke is saying about how, you know, not only does eating a balanced, regular diet and not leaving too long between your meals help, you know, when it comes to your blood sugar and make you feel better, and help you deal with the cravings, but it's also the base that you need in order to make all of the things that are going to help you feel good in your body. So I love that. That was really super interesting for me, but I'm kind of a nerd when it comes to that stuff. So thank you.
As you can tell, I get very nerdy about it as well. And, you know, it's one of those things that it's difficult, you know, without the biochemistry background and understanding all of that. And I agree with you, Wendy, that it is really breaking it down to proteins, like I said, every 3 to 4 hours, keeping that blood sugar stable, having a lot of those good nutrient dense foods, so veggies as often as possible, as much as you can, getting those different colors because all of those colored foods have the different nutrients. And I would also say focusing on liver support foods. So things like cruciferous veggies, beets, some of the spices like turmeric, ginger, omega-3s. And when it comes to protein, fish is really my favorite. So if you could get salmon in a few times a week, that's going to not only help with those omega-3s, reduce inflammation, help repair the gut, support the brain, but also are going to be really important for the liver as well.
Awesome. So one other thing we haven't really talked about yet, but it's something that Sarah and I, it's Dr. Sarah Bailey, who's my good buddy and also naturopathic doctor. And we talk all the time, constantly talking. People are sick of hearing us talk about perimenopause and menopause. But one of the things that we talk about is the direct impact. So what we're talking about, we've been talking about is more like the generalized impact of drinking on our body and our hormones. But there are also a couple, and my understanding is a couple of really direct impacts that alcohol can have on some of these symptoms. So for example, it'll act as a vasodilator, which will increase your I don't actually understand what's happening there. You can explain that, but it will increase, it will make it more difficult for your body to regulate its temperature and will increase the likelihood of a hot flash or a night sweat. And then also for me in particular, my drink of choice was red wine, which is also full of histamines, which would also exacerbate all of that for me. So is that something that you can speak to a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. So when it comes to histamines, so histamines are produced in our digestive system. A lot of us associate histamine with seasonal allergies, right? Mm-hmm. So when we have an allergic response, or let's say if we eat something that we might be allergic to, we take a Benadryl, and Benadryl is an antihistamine, right? So alcohol, because it's fermented, and this happens with a lot of fermented foods otherwise, so something like a sauerkraut or a kimchi, it increases histamine levels in the body. And that specifically happens within the gut. That can happen if you have elevated levels of yeast in the gut, like Candida. Those can also produce histamines. And the reaction that people often get when histamines are elevated is they get flushed. They get almost those allergic type reactions. So some people get a sniffly nose or having to clear their throat. For a lot of people, and this is what happened with me, a lot of hiving issues. So random skin hives on the legs, on the arms, on the stomach, and those can be a histamine reaction as well. And for some people, it might just be a little bit of a nuance or a nuisance, right? That, okay, they have these itches or a little bit of sniffles, but over the long term, what's happening is it's an immune response, right? So the more that we're putting those histamines into our system, the more we're aggravating our immune system. It's causing an overburden in our immune system. That's going to make us maybe more susceptible to different bacteria or viruses, getting sick more frequently, and also things like autoimmune diseases down the line, right? Because anytime our immune system is out of whack, we start to see these types of things happening on a more long-term or a chronic type of basis. Mm-hmm. So that is an important one to consider. And that also goes into the gut as well. As it relates to, the challenge is that it's going to increase blood pressure. Alcohol is going to increase blood pressure. So people find, especially if they have a tendency towards elevated blood pressure, that when they drink, their blood pressure goes up. This is not only creating cardiovascular risk in that you're getting these kind of short stints of this elevated blood pressure, but it's also putting stress on the different cells in the heart. It's putting stress on the venous system. When we talk about temperature regulation, this gets into some of the parts of the brain that are really driving our hormone production, driving hormones that actually control or regulate our temperature. And this also gets into some of the thyroid piece as well, because anytime you have cortisol imbalance, you're going to have sex hormone and thyroid hormone imbalance. And it's kind of like a triangle. If you have a sex hormone imbalance, you're likely going to have cortisol imbalances. And so it's really, really complex, but really simple when we start to break it down. And what I would say, if you're listening, and again, this stuff can get a little bit confusing or overwhelming, is if you are drinking on a regular basis, so let's call it 3 or more days a week, you're having at least one drink or more a day, I would say that there's a good chance that there's something going on in your body that alcohol is contributing to. So if you are looking to lose weight, if you're looking to balance hormones, if you're looking to support anxiety or mood imbalances, if you're looking to reduce inflammation or support your digestive system, there's a good likelihood that alcohol is contributing to some of those. And even doing a simple test at home where maybe you try to cut it out for 2 weeks or so, you might notice really significant improvements in that time period that might say to you, actually, this is the route that I want to go down because I'm noticing that it's having an improvement in my health. And if you are doing so, you can incorporate proteins and all of those healthy foods, like we mentioned, to make sure that you're rebalancing your system in the meantime.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. So helpful. So alcohol doesn't contain histamines, it causes a histamine response.
Yeah, and it has to do with, again, like the fermented fat of alcohol. So anything that's fermented is going to increase histamine response.
That's so interesting. Yeah. Okay. So that is, for me, when I was perimenopausal, the early years of perimenopause for me, I think were probably around age like 41 to 46-ish, 45-ish. In those years, I was having all kinds of different perimenopausal symptoms that I had no idea were actually perimenopausal. I knew nothing about this at that time, which is one of the reasons why I talk about it so much on this podcast, because I think it's so empowering for women to understand they're not actually losing their minds. It's just part of the process. But what happened for me is that I stopped drinking when I was 46 and I'm almost 51 now. And I was still in perimenopause and I really wasn't paying attention to it because I was focused on all the other great things that were coming to me as a result of not drinking anymore. But at some point I realized, holy crap, I haven't had any of these I'm not having night sweats anymore. I haven't had hot flashes. I'm not, my mood feels way more predictable and regulated. And so I noticed after a period of time, what a big impact it had had on those symptoms. And they basically disappeared for me, like I said, until I went through full menopause when they came back with a vengeance. But it's really interesting to me now to look back on that. And I would just encourage any woman who's struggling with those things, who has actually identified those, which I hadn't done, to experiment, like Brooke says, with just taking a break from alcohol for a couple of weeks and just noticing whether it's making any difference for you. Because for me, it was pretty extreme, the connection. And I know if you've listened to any of the podcasts I've done with Dr. Sarah, that she talks about how she can't have more than a half a glass of alcohol without going into a full sweat. And I've seen it. I've seen her go into a full sweat. And we've also talked about, Brooke, and this might be interesting too, is this idea that our window of tolerance shrinks on these things as we get older, so that the things that we normally could tolerate in larger amounts and maybe not have as much of an obvious impact on how we're feeling, seems to get smaller and smaller as we get older, so that it's not just alcohol, it's sugar. So I've watched her, which it makes me laugh, and I can laugh at her because she's a good friend of mine. But I'm on HRT now, so it doesn't happen to me anymore. But I've watched her eat ice cream and then have like a massive sweat afterwards.
Yeah.
And
and some of that too goes into, as we age, naturally, we've done more damage to our body. Our liver might be more burdened by hormones and toxins and all of those types of things. Our gut may be imbalanced in that we have these different types of bad bacteria that have overgrown, or yeast colonies that have overgrown. And this is all very common in the gut space that people experience on a regular basis. And a lot of people notice all of a sudden my tolerance has changed. And part of that might be, especially with alcohol, might be that your liver is overburdened, right? And the liver actually can't process alcohol in the way that it previously had, because we've started to damage some of those pathways. We don't have enough antioxidants in the body to kind of quelch the damage or put out the fire, if you will, from some of the byproducts or the toxins that are produced by alcohol. So it's a fascinating topic. I mean, I'm sure we could go on and on about it for
we could talk about
days.
We sure could. We could talk about it for a long time, but I think that has been just a really good introduction for people as to the connection between alcohol and women's reproductive hormones, and also the role that diet can play in supporting you. So if you're listening to this and you're trying to make some change with your relationship with alcohol, whether that's just drinking less or it's stopping drinking altogether and you've been struggling with that, this might be a piece of the puzzle that's been missing for you. And it might be the one thing, you know, I'm always talking about this idea of like, for me, burnout and drinking was like death by 1,000 paper cuts. It wasn't one thing that caused me to get to that place that I got to. And so the healing from it for me is like healing by, 10,000 Band-Aids, except Band-Aids is a bad word because I'm always trying to get to the root cause and not just put a Band-Aid on things. But the point is that it's not just one thing that needs to change to get you to a place where you feel whole and healthy and fulfilled as a human. It's all of these things. And so this might be one of those pieces that's been missing for you that you can work on. And I'm all about having as many tools in your toolkit as possible and setting yourself up for long-lasting permanent success. And I love what you've shared with us today. I think it will be really helpful for many people listening. And it's been really, really interesting for me to listen to. And I hope that my perimenopausal and menopausal peeps, and also my, alcohol-free peeps and my hoping to be more free from alcohol peeps all found this to be really helpful like I did. I think it's been fantastic. So thank you so much for taking the time to explain all that.
Yeah, thank you so much, Wendy. Love talking about this. So always happy to gab on about it.
Yeah, so great. So where can people find out more about you? If you've got a website or an Instagram platform you can direct people to?
Yeah, so I do have a website. It's brookescheller.com, Scheller. And I'm sure Wendy will share that in the show notes as well. And you can also find me on Instagram, Dr. Brooke Scheller. And that is a great place to follow me, where you can get lots of free tips, lots of fun reels and videos and things that contain a lot of my little tidbits that can really be big game changers as it comes to changing your relationship with alcohol. So if you do go to my website, I do have a free guide for you to download. And I'd love for you to check out the Functional Sobriety Network, which is my members only space where we use a nutrition and functional medicine based approach to changing your relationship with alcohol, and some new fun courses launching soon too. So it is really fun for me to use my expertise in this area that I'm really passionate about. And I really hope that this helped some of your listeners today, Wendy.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you so much. I know that it did. I look forward to the feedback to this episode because I think it's going to be fantastic. Thanks again, Brooke. It was great chatting with you.
Thank you.
You've been listening to Bite Size Balance with your host, Wendy McCallum. As a certified Naked Mind coach, I help busy women like you find freedom from alcohol. If you're starting to question your relationship with alcohol, you'll want to listen to my free 3-part video series where I address the top 3 myths around why you think you need to drink. Sign up now at www.wendymccallum.com/myths. That's www.wendymccallum.com/myths.